Good evening.
Good evening.
It's great to be here. It's great to be back again together, worshiping God, singing Him songs of praise, giving Him glory and honor. I'm thankful for we have this opportunity to give worship and praise to God. Our series on Sunday nights has been looking through the book of 1 Kings. The title of this series has been The Kingdom After David. When we began this series, one of the things that we mentioned was that you don't often get to have, not so much in depth, but even a study chronologically through these books of kingdom history. Sometimes they're seen as dry or just a storyline. In fact, many times when people get to their Bible reading plans and they're going through, they'll just kind of skip Kings and Chronicles and just read 1st, 2nd Samuel. There you get all the fun stuff about David and Goliath. But really an essential part of Israel's history and its relationship with God is found in 1st and 2nd Kings. This is what you might call the rise and then the decline of a great nation. This evening's lesson is going to be centered around 1 Kings chapter 5. And during this part of our study, we're still together studying through the rise of the nation of Israel. What we might call its greatest period. The title of this evening's lesson is Brick by Brick, because that's exactly what we're going to be looking at this evening. Solomon is going to begin building the temple. Solomon is going to begin this project of building a house of worship for the Lord. If you will, go ahead and turn over to 1 Kings chapter 5. We're just going to read the first 5 verses of chapter 5 here to kind of set our minds for this evening's lesson. If you will follow along with me, I'm going to have it up here on the screen beside me, but as always, I'd encourage you to follow along in your Bibles as well. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon, whom he heard that they had anointed him in place of his father. For Hiram always loved David, and Solomon sent word to Hiram, "You know that David my father could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. So I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. As the Lord said to David my father, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, shall build a house for my name." One of the greatest accomplishments that Solomon gave to the nation of Israel was really himself. I don't mean that to speak so highly of Solomon that no one could ever compare to him, but having a wise king really makes all the difference. And if you don't remember anything else out of this lesson this morning, please remember these 3 things that occurred because of the wise king Solomon that they had, and the 3 things that really surrounded and defined this time in Israel's existence. First, we're going to look at Israel's golden age and what all kind of an impact that had and why they had this golden age. Second, we're going to look at what David couldn't do and why. And then third and finally this evening, we're going to be looking at Solomon's temple and what impact that had on everything in Israel's history. First, Israel's golden age. It seems like every nation has this golden age. Every world power seems to have this time when they're just at their prime. For Rome, it was the Pax Romana, the time of Roman peace, where there wasn't great wars and everything seemed to be just fine. Unfortunately, just about all of these golden ages, golden eras in a nation's history are often followed by a decline and then a fall. Looking through each great civilization all the way back to the beginning, you'll see this kind of go on in history. But the question could be asked, why? Why did Israel have this golden age? Why were they finally at a time when everything seemed to be booming? If you've ever looked at a map of the city of Jerusalem, you'll notice that here's the Jerusalem that we might call pre-biblical history or outside biblical history, when the Jebusites lived in Jerusalem. And you have this small area. And then David takes over. And when David's king, Jerusalem expands. And then when Solomon's king, you see this huge expansion of the city of Jerusalem, where Temple Mount becomes the center area of Israel. If you look at the nation of Israel itself and its borders, and people that are subjugated to Israel, Looking when they first get into Canaan around the time of the Judges, and then it growing when David becomes king and wars with all the nations around, and then when Solomon becomes king. And it grows by leaps and bounds. It's amazing to see what all happened when Solomon took the throne. I don't doubt at all that this was partially due to the labors of his father David and all the great things that David did, the warring that he did that helped pay the price to be able to have that expanding of a nation. But notice in 2 Chronicles 17, verses 3 and 4, notice here about Jehoshaphat and what made him such a great king. 2 Chronicles chapter 17, verses 3 and 4. The Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he walked in the earlier ways of his father David. He did not seek the Baals, but sought the God of his father and walked in the commandments and not according to the practices of Israel. See, Israel had at this time began its decline. Jehoshaphat reigned far after Solomon, and the kings of Israel followed a very dark path. They had split Israel, or going into deep, deep idolatry. But Jehoshaphat started returning to God. There's very few kings that we could call the good kings after Solomon. But Jehoshaphat seems to be one of them. What happened because of this? What was the result? Well, the Lord was with Jehoshaphat. The Lord was with Jehoshaphat behind him because he walked in the way of his father David. He was behind him because he was not following after all the idols. To give a little more specifics, if you continue reading there in verse 5, therefore the Lord established the kingdom in his hand, and all Judah brought tribute to Jehoshaphat, and he had great riches and honor. His heart was courageous in the ways of the Lord, and furthermore he took the high places in Asherim out of Judah. Why does a nation prosper? Why is there peace and security? Specifically here what we're looking at is God's nation, God's people. You're looking at the nation of Israel at this time was his nation, his people. How did they prosper? Why were they growing? Well, in Jehoshaphat's time, it's because they had a king who was seeking after him. And if you look at his contemporaries and those that directly preceded, directly would follow him, many of the other kings didn't seek after God as they should. Many of them built these high places, set up altars to the Asherim and to the Baals that Jehoshaphat would be tearing down. When Hezekiah had to do his reforms, he had to do his reforms because of the evil of the other kings, following after the mistakes that Rehoboam and Jeroboam made, going all the way back to them. But Israel had a golden age. Why? I think it's interesting to notice that when Jehoshaphat sought God and was trying to follow him, that it was then things started going well. That God was blessing a man to rule when he was ruling well, when he was ruling the way he wanted him to. And we want to specifically mention again here that this is talking about the nation of Israel. It's talking about God's nation. So I don't think it's any coincidence that God blessed him to rule over his people when he was doing it the way he wanted him to. When he was ruling over his people, seeking after God, seeking what's best for him. Next, you might notice about this golden age that, once again, this doesn't seem to be all coincidence. In Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 1, this is kind of aforementioned that this sort of thing would happen. That when you have a king seeking after God, when you have a nation of people seeking after God, that good things would come out of that. Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 1. Remember here the immediate context. This is speaking nation of Israel. I don't know that we could rip this out of its context and apply it to any nation in the world, but certainly it couldn't be a negative application. In Deuteronomy 28 and verse 1, here God says, and if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. Now remember, the entire book of Deuteronomy is this sermon that Moses is giving to Israel, recounting the old law and encouraging them to abide in the old law, encouraging them to abide in God's favor. And here, what he's saying from God to them is that if you faithfully obey God, if you dwell in his commandments and be very careful to do everything that he's instructed, God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. David is described as being a man after God's own heart. David is described as doing everything that he did to please God, except for a couple of matters where he would make mistakes. A couple of matters such as Uriah the Hittite and the sin with Bathsheba. But his entire way of life seemed to be focused in the direction of seeking God. What did that accomplish? God set a son on his throne. God set his own son to rule after him. And then this son that ruled after him sought God. He asked for the wisdom to rule his people the way God wanted it ruled. And what did God do? He established it. Remember last week when we were talking about this, he said, since you didn't ask for great riches, or for your enemies to be defeated, I'm going to give that to you too. Because what Solomon asked for was greater. He asked for the ability to serve, the capacity that God needed him to. He asked for the wisdom to rule over his people. And then comes this golden age. Then comes this time of growth and expansion and wealth. The wealth of Solomon's Israel is said to surpass any nation of that area in that time, and perhaps leading up through the future. It was quite a powerful, strong nation. He had trade routes throughout the world. He had established allies with nations throughout the world. People from all around the world were coming to Solomon to hear his wisdom. People from around the world were trying to make allies with him. When we read of all the wives and concubines he's had, we understand that a large portion of that was due to some of the alliances he was making in order to become friends with this nation and friends with that nation. Solomon, because he dwelt in this time of peace and security, was able to do something that David was not. See, David didn't live at a time of peace and security. David spent a good portion of his life on the run, hiding from those that would seek to kill him, hiding from those that would take his life. David was disqualified from this particular service. That's interesting to me. It's interesting to me that there are certain things that could disqualify him. Now, please don't misunderstand me. David was a great man. David was a wonderful person. He was a great servant of God that did many great things. Yet, throughout all of his many things, one thing that he could not do was build a house for God. If you will, turn over to 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 3. 1 Chronicles 28 verse 3. Here David is giving his charge to Israel, and he says, "But God said to me, you may not build a house for my name, for you are a man of war and have shed blood." He goes on to describe that God is going to provide a way for this, that there is going to be someone that will build this house. He goes on describing to Israel how they need to faithfully seek God. But that's interesting to me, that because of the blood that was on David's head, it's from warring, because he was a man of war who had shed blood, that he wasn't qualified for this service. He was certainly qualified to bring peace to Israel. He was certainly qualified, like Saul was, to war against the nations that were fighting to seek to destroy Israel. But he wasn't qualified for this particular service. But now Solomon is able to do that very thing which his father David could not. He's able to build a temple for the Lord. I think there's something interesting for us to notice there. That we can't be properly fitted for every good work in the sense where we are the best person for every job. There are some tasks that are better accomplished by others. There are some tasks that we're just not made to do. I used to know a man who was just an excellent plumber. And I say that because there are some people who are horrible plumbers. And if you've ever had work done by them, you'll know what I'm talking about. You quickly had to find someone else to come and finish up the work that they started or very badly messed up. If you would like to see one, here is a perfect example of a horrible plumber. If something goes wrong, I call someone who knows what they're doing. I'm not the guy you want fastening pipes under your house. You're going to have a pool in your living room if you let me do that. So not everyone is equipped for the same work. I enjoy sitting over at the peach stand with Marty during the summer. It's enjoyable just to get to see all the people he knows. He knows everybody in 6 counties around, but it's enjoyable also because Marty and I think differently about some things. Generally, if it comes to interest, we're all in line in the same way. But I'm not a numbers guy. I don't think numerically. I don't remember numbers. I think thematically. I remember ideas, thoughts. I can remember what was said. Marty's kind of the opposite of that. A lot of times he may not remember exactly what was said, but he can tell you his girlfriend's phone number he had in middle school. Different individuals function in different ways that often make them better suited for certain works. It's not necessarily a bad thing, any more than it was negative here of a difference between David and Solomon. David wasn't less of a servant because he could not build a house for the Lord. I'm sure it discouraged him. I'm sure it made him a little bothered. He had his mind to do this. He seemed to write up all the plans and then pass that on to his son Solomon. He spoke to Solomon quite a bit about it because he had aimed for him then to build that house. But David, he was just a man of war. I don't think we often picture David as that. Sometimes our mind gets stuck on what we see in Bible school, doesn't it? When I picture David, what do you picture? I picture a little boy with a sling, beating the big Goliath, right? But that doesn't seem to be an accurate description of who David was. Even when he was younger, he had not been a man of war. It doesn't insinuate that he was a scrawny little boy. Evidently, he fit Saul's armor somewhat. He just hadn't tested it. For Saul to even suggest a young little boy about that tall wear a king's armor that was a foot taller than everyone else doesn't seem logical. And the reason David didn't wear it wasn't because he didn't say, this is huge, there's no way I can fit into this. He said, I haven't tested it, so I shouldn't take it into battle. I'm not used to it. David was a warrior. David was a mighty king. In 1 Samuel 18 and verse 7, here Saul and David are coming back from battle, and notice what the women here are singing. The women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. That didn't make King Saul very happy. He didn't like them exalting David above him. He was king after all. It would lead him to eventually seek David's life several times. But David, man, he was a warrior. He had a lot of blood on his hands. I don't mean to suggest it was unjust. I don't mean to suggest it was wrong or that it was not in God's will. I think it certainly was in God's will. I think God used him to defeat the Philistines, to weaken that nation quite a bit. There are many occasions when David would war against the Philistines, when he raped individuals and villages that would have caused Israel much problem. But that made him unqualified for this service. That made him unqualified for this work. But Solomon, he lived in a different time. He got to reap a lot of the benefits of David's warring. He got to reap a lot of the benefits of David going out and having a strong army and building a mighty nation. Another phrase we're often accustomed to, David's mighty men. Apart from himself being a great warrior, he surrounded himself with mighty men. These other great warriors that were able to accomplish great feats. You can read about many of them in these books that we're looking at right now. These mighty men, these great warriors had established a name for themselves. The other nations knew about David and his mighty men. The other nations knew about David, the slayer of the giant Philistine. The other nations had heard about David, this shepherd boy that rose to the king. Solomon was very blessed. He was blessed by what his father had done before him. In the time he lived in, he didn't have to wage these great war campaigns like David did. He didn't have to fight for his life in many situations. A lot of that had already been accomplished for him. This evening, though, I don't want us to just look at what situation Israel had come in. I don't want us to neglect really what the central point has been leading up to all evening. Solomon's temple. I wish I could have seen it. Many people, many artists have made depictions of what they imagine it looked like. Some people have tried to recreate what they thought Solomon's temple looked like, but I don't think it would be any way possible to capture the great splendor which it was. That kind of thing just can't be reproduced. Solomon's temple. Much more than what it looked like itself is what it represented. Represented finally having some solidarity to the nation of Israel. Before, when God had been with Israel through a tent of meeting, through a tabernacle, something to be picked up and moved. Now, having a house. They're settled. They're established in the land. In Ezra chapter 3 and verse 12, the nation of Israel had been brought away into captivity. This is a while after Solomon's temple has been destroyed. And they've come back now. They've come back to Israel. They're rebuilding the walls of the city, rebuilding the city itself, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the altar. They've laid the foundation for the altar. In Ezra chapter 3 and verse 12, what happens when some of these older men, some of these leaders, some of these people who have been around and seen the first temple, what happens when they see the foundation of this new temple being erected? In Ezra chapter 3 and verse 12, but many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy. I'm sure this was amazing if you'd never seen the other temple, and finally this temple is being rebuilt. Seeing the foundations, like, there's a house again. But if you had seen the grandeur of Solomon's house, the grandeur of the temple that Solomon had built, the beautiful gold filigree, those amazing pillars, beautiful wood that he had to chop down for that very purpose. All the engraving had been done, and engraving in these trees, engraving into the cherubim and everything. Boy, it must have been beautiful. And its size, it must have been massive. We have a rough estimate of how big it was based on the measurement they had at those times. This one was quite a bit smaller. When they saw the foundations being laid, realizing there was nothing that would compare with the house that Solomon built. Nothing that would compare with the temple that Solomon had put together. They wept. They cried. This temple that Solomon built, he spared no expense for it. He ended up having to give over some of the cities in Galilee, just ended up paying off some of this debt. A huge amount of debt that was incurred here. He spared no expense when it came to building this temple. But even it was destroyed. Even this temple fell. And then when Ezra and them come back and they build a new temple, they set up the priesthood again, it would later fall. A Roman governor would later basically remodel the entire thing. In fact, they say he even scraped the foundation stone and started back and made it bigger. But even this very same temple would be destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. It wouldn't stand. Now there are many traditional Jews that pray several times a day, every day, asking that a temple be rebuilt in Jerusalem. But they're missing something. When Jesus walked this earth, he promised to build a house, to build a church, to build an assembly. But it wasn't going to be a building that was made with hands, something that the people of that time understood, something that his disciples and the apostles and the gospel writers understood. I find it interesting that even the people who didn't like him understood that. In Mark chapter 14 and verse 58, here they're making accusations against Jesus, not really understanding some of the things that he had said and trying to set up false witnesses against him. And they said, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Now they made a little twist on what he said, combining a couple of different ideas. He had never really actually said that from any account that we have. But he did say, I'll destroy this temple and raise it in 3 days. They assumed he was talking about the temple that was standing there. The rebuilt temple, the modified temple by the Roman governor. He wasn't talking about that temple, he was talking about the temple of his body. But something that both Peter and Paul would end up conveying. God doesn't dwell in a house that's made with hands, in a temple that's made with hands. People would say that he doesn't dwell in a temple made with hands. Paul would quote and say that the heavens itself is his throne and the earth his footstool. Everything in creation is his. He doesn't need us to build a house for him. You see, Jesus did build a church. He does have a kingdom that is not made with human hands. The Hebrew writer gives comfort to his readers by informing them that the kingdom that has been set up by Jesus is one that has foundations that can't be shaken. No earthquake can cause the walls to fall. No war, no army can lay siege to it and destroy it. There's nothing that could be done to cause this kingdom to fall. What encouragement that must have been to a people that saw their city ransacked over and over again, that had seen the temple burn, to a people that had had their religion all but obliterated by captivity, had their people dispersed from around the world, many who would never come back. What comfort that must have been. Was Solomon's temple grand? Yes. Was it amazing to behold? I don't doubt it at all. The description of it alone is amazing. I encourage you to read it sometime in its entirety. But there's something even more beautiful, something even more amazing. There's something that we're waiting to see in its fullness, but we're viewing in part right now as we look around. His assembly, gathered here this evening to sing songs of praise to Him. His assembly, gathered here this evening to worship Him, to glorify Him, and to honor Him. More beautiful than all the artistry that He could have provided in Solomon's temple. His people gathered here to lift His name up in prayer. Better than any incense that ever could have been burned. We gathered this morning to remember the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. A sacrifice that was more precious than all the bulls and goats that was ever slaughtered on the altar outside His temple. Remembering the sacrifice that gives us a hope to have an eternity along with Him in heaven. This evening, I hope this lesson's been informative. I hope it's been helpful in that way. I hope you've gained some knowledge or at least a better understanding of something. But I hope that's not all. I hope that's not all you've gotten out of this. I hope you've realized that there is a city that has been built. There is a place of dwelling and abode with God that is ready, that is prepared. That has foundations that can't be shaken. Walls that can't be torn down. A place that is more beautiful, majestic. There's no need to have to worry about where your next meal is coming from. There's a place where there's no need to worry about anything. A place where you can go and just dwell with your God, worshiping Him and glorifying Him for the rest of eternity. No need to worry about pain, heartache, loss. You'll be eternally secure with all those that love God. All those who will dwell with Him for eternity. The question that I want to leave you with, though, is, are you going? Are you on your way there? Are you on your way to that beautiful city, that home in heaven? Are you on your way to be with your God for forever? Or on your way somewhere else? Chances are you know in your heart right now, this evening. I'm not talking about what you tell others. I'm not talking about how you feel, what you communicate to others about whether or not you think you're a nice person. I'm talking about your relationship with God. Chances are you know exactly where you are. You're either happy and excited because you know you're doing everything you can to praise God, doing everything that you can to do His will, to walk in the light, to be with Him for all eternity. Or you know that you're not quite there. Or you know that in your heart that you're not truly following Him with everything you have. That there's at least a part of you that you're not willing to give over to Him, to let Him be king over. If that's the case, then I hope you change. Because I want to be with you there for eternity. If that's the case, I hope you make the decision this evening, or at any time, before it's everlastingly too late, to be His and only His. To serve Him with all your heart, so that we can all enjoy the peace that's coming. If you're here this evening, and there's something on your mind, something in your heart you need to change, something you need prayers for, something that we can encourage one another with, then let me know. Come forward and let us pray for you. If you're subject to invitation, won't you come right now together?